This episode tries to prove that Mindy can stand on her own, and then spends half an hour making her look like she forgot how to function.
I want to do this on my own.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
You sure?
12 seconds later.
Hey, babe.
Danny, I need you to come back. Turns out I do need your help.
The Mindy Project usually does its best work when it lets big life changes breathe. New jobs, new relationships, new power dynamics. Those episodes tend to slow down just enough to let the characters recalibrate. This one doesn't do that. Stanford throws Mindy into a major life transition and then immediately undercuts it with chaos. Not character-driven chaos, sitcom scramble chaos. And while that leads to a handful of laughs, it also makes the episode feel oddly disposable for what should have been a defining moment. There are good ideas here, there are even good scenes, but they never quite cohere into a story that knows what it wants to say about Mindy, Danny, or this new phase of her life. So with that in mind, welcome back to The Rank. I'm John, and today we're going to be ranking the 12th episode of the 3rd season of the Mindy Project titled Stanford, written by Mindy Kaling and Tracy Wigfield, and directed by Michael Spillett. So let's find out how this one stacks up, starting with the episode overview. So we're going to start the episode off with one of my favorite bits of the show, when they have Mindy doing a voiceover to introduce the episode, and it ends up with her actually talking to someone. She's talking to Danny, and what she's talking about is going across the country from New York to Stanford, and she's equating it to the show Felicity, which I've never seen, so I didn't really get it. But when she finally goes into a room at Stanford, she's greeted by an Indian woman named Nipa, who is speaking Hindi to her, which catches Mindy looking like a deer in headlights. Now Danny's gonna be like, I got this, and starts speaking Spanish to her. Obviously the woman is not Spanish, and she ends up asking where Mindy's from. Boston, baby! Home of the Freedom Trail and Tom Brady's penis. Wow, Mindy. Also, Neil, Nipa's son, is sitting right there. But Nipa is talking about where she's from, and saying that her husband is working in a chemical plant in India until the fellowship is over, and they can be a family again. So naturally, Mindy and Danny are gonna try to align with her problems. And to do that, they basically talk about the fact that Danny's all the way in New York. But thankfully, he's got a lot of airline miles, so he's going to be able to visit Mindy whenever he wants. But the aligning with the problems is that he gets the airline miles by complaining to the airlines because he doesn't like gate changes. So, they're roughly in the same situation. After this introduction is done, we're gonna go to Mindy's room, and we get a couple bits here. Like Danny seemingly sending Mindy off like he's her father, and Mindy not knowing who Rosie the Riveter is. So far, it hasn't been strong, but I always give this writing team a chance. Now, from there, we're gonna head to the B story. And the B story is that Morgan has created an office basketball team for something. The team consists of him, Tamara, and Danny, which we find out with some Microsoft product placement, as they call him from a laptop instead of a phone. It isn't too long after that we realize the basketball team is really just an excuse for Tamara to try to get Morgan back. So we're gonna go back to the A story, and Mindy has shown up to her first class in a very bright pink dress, thinking that it was a party she was going to. The fellowship supervisor / professor calls her medically blonde, which I thought was a really great joke, actually. But it just keeps getting worse as Mindy continues to disrupt. And he's like, would you just sit down? And she says she can't sit in that dress. Why? Because she's not wearing any underwear. Mindy, what are you doing? Now, it turned out that Danny went to college with the fellowship supervisor guy, whose name is Dr. Rob Gurgler. He actually offers to put in a good word on Mindy's behalf, but Mindy wants to do it on her own. So she goes to apologize to Gurgler, and he's just a giant douchebag. He even calls her an idiot, which is just crazy disrespectful and unnecessary. And because of this, Mindy breaks down and name drops Danny to him. To which Gurgler replies, it makes sense that he's dating her because he was always into Hispanic girls. Wow. So what this means is that she's going to make Danny miss his flight, which means Danny won't be able to make the first basketball game either. She makes him miss his flight so that he can go to dinner with Gurgler, his wife, and Mindy, and talk Mindy up. So we're going to head back to the B story because now Morgan needs to find a replacement for Danny. Tamara ends up convincing Peter to do it, and the game is still on, which for Tamara means she just gets more of an opportunity to win Morgan back. There was one funny part in the scene where Peter says that he really just plays pickup basketball as an excuse to use black slang, and then tries to get by Tamara and says, "Excuse me, blood." I just thought that was ridiculous. But that's basically it. We're going back to the A story, and we're at the dinner. Rob's wife Barb seems to just basically despise her husband, which is awkward. But Danny's talking Mindy up and tells Gurgler how he's really going to enjoy having Mindy, that he should take her to Alcatraz. To which Mindy replies, "Oh, I'd love that. What is that?" And Barb answers after an eye roll from Rob, "It's the world's most famous marriage." Yikes. Eventually, we're going to see that Barb is really into Danny and starts giving Danny a foot job under the table. Of course, Danny thinks it's Mindy, but before we can see where this is ultimately headed, we head back to New York to see them practicing basketball. We're going to get a cute bit about Peter making shots and Morgan saying, "You must have watched the game tape I sent you." And we find out the game tape was just a copy of Space Jam. But Tamara's going to push Morgan to go out with her after the practice, to which Morgan declines because he's got plans with Jessica, who shows up right at that moment. And I love that Tamara doesn't hide her feelings at all. She looks at Jessica and says, "Who you supposed to be?" And Tamara's going to quit the team because of this. And Morgan's like, "No, we need you." And then he's going to lament that she's the only one who watched Space Jam. So we're going to head back to the dinner with the Gurglers. And Barb is really going to town on Danny. It's super awkward with Danny praising the cheesecake in the guise of liking the foot job. And Rob and Mindy are surprised because he's always said that dessert is weakness entering the body. And then Danny has an orgasm. I have to say, I did not expect them to take it this far. Holy cow. Of course, after dinner, Danny is telling Mindy how great the foot job was. And she's like, "What are you talking about?" So the next thing we see is them going into Mindy's room and Mindy saying that he cheated on her. But also they can't tell Gurgler because then Gurgler would just hate Mindy more. And then she says to Danny, "This is all your fault." And Danny's like, "I changed my plans to stay longer to help you." And she's like, "The only reason you stayed to help is because he doesn't think that she can do it on her own." And then he agrees and packs up and leaves. Now, I get that she shouldn't have said that it was all your fault, Danny, but you could give her a little leeway here. She just heard that some other woman gave you a foot job under the table at a dinner with her. Give her a little grace, man. But we're going to head back to the basketball game. Jeremy has graciously replaced Tamara, but he's never played basketball before, which seems like a bad person to have on the team then. Now, Morgan's team is named Morgan's Best Friends, and they're wondering who their opponent is going to be. And so then Tamara comes through the door, and her team's jersey says, "Morgan's Worst Nightmare." And in the game, Morgan's Best Friends gets their asses kicked. Then, just to make sure that the audience hasn't forgotten about the A story, they have a quick scene with Mindy ordering a bunch of burgers from a drive-thru, and Nipa just happens to be there as a worker. And then Nipa's gonna complain about the second-generation immigrants and how they're lazy and spoiled and stuff. And Mindy's gonna drive off, telling her that her son Neil is gonna end up as a pool DJ or something. Then we go straight back to the basketball game. It felt a little weird to have this tiny scene, but whatever. So we're at halftime, and Morgan is suggesting that they quit because they're losing by a lot, which Jeremy is surprised by because he thought it was like golf in that the lowest score wins. I mean, that's a funny line, but if you really believed that, you'd sort of have to question his intelligence. But Peter says they're not quitting, and he pulls Tamara aside and is basically like, "You want to move on? Stop dunking on your ex-boyfriend." So she ends up letting Morgan score a point on her at the very end, and then ends up getting a date with the cocky intern from a few episodes ago, who apparently isn't dating the Asian doctor anymore? I don't know. Anyway, we're headed back to Mindy and Gurgler, and she tells him that she doesn't want special treatment. But of course, Gurgler isn't taking her seriously. So she tells him about the foot job, and then says, "So Barb's stepping out on you." Then explains that she didn't mean to make the pun, but if the shoe fits. So Gurgler's gonna get real upset and ride off on his recumbent bike, screaming, "Barbara!" and then get hit by a security vehicle. And then in the next scene, we see Mindy stitching up old Gurgs, and then him giving Mindy the lead on the surgery that he was supposed to do in like 10 minutes. But when she shows up for the surgery, she ends up giving the lead to Nipa, who she says has earned it. And then when Mindy gets back to her room, she goes to sit down, but Danny is on her bed. She was very scared to find him there and says, "Good thing I didn't unpack my gun yet. You'd be dead by now." But Danny has hung around and missed another flight because he didn't want to leave after a fight. So they make up and bang, and that's the whole episode. Let's see how it ranked.
Oh, Wayne.
So the rank is where I rank the episode based on 5 categories: story, acting, dialogue, episode coherence, and character relatability. I rank it on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. And then I have a laugh counter where I tally up the amount of times the episode made me laugh. 1 point per laugh out loud gets added to the score. And before I dive into the rankings, I just want to say if you're enjoying this episode, please leave a like down below. It really does help me out. But without further ado, the first category is story. So the story is that Mindy is in Stanford now and getting acclimated, I guess. There are some stories that happen within this, like Danny getting a foot job in the aftermath, or Mindy realizing she's spoiled, but she can do it on her own. But honestly, it felt a lot more episodic than a story. Like, let's put her here and have some shenanigans happen. Also, the B story wasn't really anything either. I gave it a 2. So that brings us to acting, and the acting was fine. The guy who played Dr. Gurgler seemed to be going for an unredeemable prick. Not really sure why. It seems like they're going to make him come off as mean because he's repressing his vulnerability, but he felt very to me. Everything else was fine. I gave it a 3.25. So that brings us to dialogue. I didn't think this episode was that funny. I will say that these writers are very good, and when an episode doesn't feel funny, it usually ends up getting me more times than I expected, and it's the same with this one. But still, it just sort of felt mashed together and not as engaging. I gave it a 2.5. So that brings us to episode coherence. So I have the same gripe with this category as I did with story. It was very episodic and just sort of jumped around. It wasn't that you couldn't follow it, it just felt sort of haphazard. Especially when they have that one random scene with Nipa working at the fast food place. That just felt so weird. I mean, it's a fellowship, right? So she's a doctor? She couldn't get a better job than that? Really? Besides that, it was such a random short scene that cut off the B story when they could have just finished it and moved back to the A story. Anyway, I gave it a 2.75. So that brings us to character relatability. I thought Danny not giving Mindy any grace after he got foot jobbed by her supervisor's wife was kind of ridiculous. Also, Dr. Gurgler doesn't feel like a real human to me yet, so it's hard to relate to him either. And it felt like Mindy was backsliding here. Like she went back to college and turned into a moron, right after all the serious stuff about wanting to go. Basically, everyone was relatable to an extent, but I was never really drawn to anyone in this episode. I gave it a 2.5. So we have some fairly low scores, but Mindy Project usually does have a decent laugh counter, which would probably keep it out of the bottom 2 tiers at least. And in this case, it got me 14 times, which is fairly decent, but the score ends up being a 27, which puts it in the tier mediocre. As for the series average, it goes down to a 36.83, which keeps the series in the holy grail. And if you're ranking along with me, drop your scores in the comments. But thanks for listening and or watching. Check out my other Mindy Project episodes or any of my other sitcom ranking or movie ranking episodes on this channel. Remember to comment, subscribe, and like. For up-to-date rankings, check out my website at therankpodcast.com, where you can also email me at john@therankpodcast.com. And if you really want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/therankpodcast. But I will leave you with this. When Barb calls Danny later and asks for career advice, what does he suggest?
Well, what is it?
Podiatry, because it's feet.
Thanks for the explanation.
And the B story is that Morgan has created an office basketball team for something. Oops.
Thanks for that.